Hello. Today, you will be listening to John Lewis Esposito talking about Paths to God, Islamic Law and Mysticism from the Great World Religions series.
The rapid expansion of Islam brought the rise of new centers of power and wealth, as we saw last class, an influx of foreign ways and greater social stratification. The contrast between the idealized community of the Prophet and the realities of Umayyad life, dissatisfaction with abuses of power and corruption, gave rise not only to revolutionary groups like the Kharijites, whom we discussed last class, but also to two major non-revolutionary reform movements or institutions, Islamic law and Sufism, or Islamic mysticism. Historically, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, Muslim scholars formulated Islamic law. Many of the earliest scholars were in fact pious Muslims who had their jobs, their day jobs as it were, as merchants and traders, but also were serious students of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. It would only be later that they would develop into a separate professional class, the ulama, literally the learned ones, the religious scholars. These early scholars developed the science of law or jurisprudence, fiqh, meaning understanding. Understanding in order to ascertain, interpret, and apply God's guidance, the Sharia, as found in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, the example of the Prophet. Based then upon both divinely revealed prescriptions, the Quran, an example of the Prophet, and their own human interpretation, they attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what we often refer to as Islamic law or Sharia. Islamic law then was a response to real religious, political, and social concerns and issues. Piety and politics were intertwined. Those who turned to law during the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th and 9th centuries did so to limit the autonomy and power of rulers by standardizing the law and taking into its control out of the hands of the caliph or his appointed judges. So they both wanted to delineate what it meant to be a good Muslim as well as limit the power of rulers. Centers or schools of thought sprang up in Medina, in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Kufa, and in Basra, across the then existing Muslim world. While many schools were established, 4 schools came to be the major Sunni law schools: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali law schools. And these have endured to modern times. Based then both upon revelation and human interpretation, which is called ijtihad, a very central concept which we'll talk about a lot during the course, scholars attempted to delineate a comprehensive blueprint for Muslim life and society, what it meant to be a good Muslim. Although there was general agreement on many matters, significant differences also existed, reflecting differences of interpretation, as well as the diverse geographic, social, and cultural context in which the jurists were writing. It made a difference whether you lived in a more conservative or, if you will, a more open society. The development of law flourished in particular during the 10th century under the Abbasid dynasty. Remember that the Abbasids enjoyed great wealth and became patrons of religious leaders of the sciences and the arts. The Abbasid caliphs, having led a rebellion that overthrew the Umayyads, sought to justify their revolution and legitimate their rule in the name of Islam, and so became the patrons of Islam. The study of Islamic sources and the development of Islamic studies in the Quran, the prophetic traditions or hadith, and law excelled in the hands of a new class of scholars. And here we see this class emerge. The ulama take their name from alim, the Arabic singular, which means a learned one. The ulama are the learned ones. They become, as it were, a religious class. Islamic law developed then as the ideal social blueprint for the believer, responding to the question, what should I do? If I am to be a Muslim and realize God's will, well, what does that mean concretely? How should I live my life? Islamic law springs from the basic meaning and requirement of Islam: submission to and realization of God's will. The Quran, remember, teaches that Muslims must strive or struggle, jihad, in the path, Sharia, in the path of God, to implement God's will on earth, expand and defend their community, and establish a just society. Like Judaism, and in contrast to Christianity's emphasis on doctrine, on correct belief, on orthodoxy, Islam emphasizes correct action, observance, or orthopraxy. Thus, in Islam, as in Judaism, law rather than theology enjoys pride of place as the central expression of the faith. One defines oneself in terms of whether one is an observant Muslim, just as one talks about an observant Jew. In Christianity, the tendency was to tilt towards doctrine. Though they overlap, the distinction between Sharia, God's law, and fiqh, human understanding and interpretation of law, is critical to understanding the meaning and dynamic nature of Islamic law and its possibilities for modern reinterpretation and reform today. Many say, is Islam and is Islamic law capable of change and reform? Well, we'll see the importance of these terms. Sharia in the Quran and in Islam refers specifically to divine law, for God is the only lawgiver. Islamic law, in many ways, is a broader category that encompasses the divine law and human understanding or interpretation, fiqh. And so it's an interpretation of God's law. Too often, though, Sharia is simply equated with the term Islamic law, obscuring the degree to which human interpretation influenced the final product, so that the final product is actually a combination of that which is immutable and that which is mutable or changeable due to human interpretation. The development of Islamic law was the work then of religious scholars, the ulama, rather than judges, courts, or governments. They primarily laid out the law that we find in the law books. The main divisions of law concern two broad areas. First, a Muslim's duties to God. Obligatory practices or essential observances. Here primarily those involved with worship. Think concretely of the 5 pillars of Islam. These are unchangeable. Second, a Muslim's duties to others, social transactions or relations. These would include regulations governing public life, from contract and international law to family laws governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Sunni Muslims recognize 4 official sources of Islamic law. The bulk of the Quran consists of broad, general, moral directives or principles, and this is the first source of law. Remember, the Quran is the book of God, the revelation. Approximately 80 prescriptions in the Quran rank as legal prescriptions in the very narrowest sense or definition of law. In other senses, you're talking about legal principles and values. And most of these come from the Medinan period, when Muhammad was establishing the first Islamic community state. The second source of law is the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet. Remember, we talked about how the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are the foundation stones. The Prophet's Sunnah, what he said and did, which were believed to be preserved in narrative stories and reports known as traditions of the Prophet, hadith. The third source is analogical reasoning, or qiyas. It's a technique used when no clear text of the Quran or the Sunnah is directly relevant to a legal question. And so when there's no clear text that exists, then jurists were free to use their independent judgment or reasoning, called ijtihad, to examine similar situations whose principles could be applied to this new situation. This, of course, led to a great deal of diversity of opinion. The fourth source of law is the consensus, the ijma' of the community. In practice, it came to be understood as the consensus of the majority of scholars, religious scholars, the ulama, who were the guardians and interpreters of the law. In many ways, the self-proclaimed guardians and interpreters. This source originated from a tradition of the Prophet that said, my community will never agree on an error. Now, while that tradition of the Prophet was referring to the ummah, the community in general, as I said, over time it came to be understood as the ulama, as in speaking for the community, the representatives of the community, because they were the knowledgeable ones. They knew the religious sources. Concern for justice led to the development of other subsidiary legal principles. Among them were equity, which permits exceptions to a strict or literal legal reasoning in favor of public interest, another source, public interest or human welfare, the general welfare, assuring a flexibility that enabled judges to arrive at just and equitable decisions. Now, Shi'i Muslims have a somewhat different set of legal sources. And most importantly, within this context, we need to note that they accept, yes, the Quran and the Sunnah, but also their own collections of the traditions of Ali and his successors as Imam. Remember in Shi'ism the importance of Ali and the Imams, whom they regard as supreme authorities and legal interpreters. Now, while there is a unity, an overall unity within Islamic law, it's important to note there's also a diversity. Islamic law is both a source of unity as well as difference and diversity. While the four schools of law agree in their essentials, they differ in a number of particulars, reflecting the role of individual reasoning and social custom. There'll be differences about the qualifications in terms of who you can marry, or areas that have to do with the maintenance of a wife, how much maintenance and for how long. This will vary from school to school. Individual jurists differ in their interpretation of texts. They, after all, were using their human reason, their personal opinions, their notions of equity and public welfare. So too the diverse social backgrounds and cultural context of legal scholars. The technical term for legal scholars here is a faqih, the plural, a fuqaha, to refer to the jurist or the legal scholar. That also affected their judgments and informed their interpretations. What was their social context? What was the cultural context? Thus, law schools differed about the grounds on which a woman could sue for divorce or an amount to be paid for maintenance. The differences in local customs of the more cosmopolitan and class-conscious city of Kufa, a Hanafi center, versus the more conservative Medina, where the Maliki law school developed, can be seen in the varying regulations of these law schools. A similar diversity is illustrated by the official legal opinions or interpretations, what are called fatwas. A fatwa is a legal opinion rendered by an expert, a consultant, a mufti. And we see these terms emerging more in our media. The mufti is one who advises judges and advises litigants. It's a bit like in a law case today where either the plaintiff, the defendant, might go to a prominent legal scholar at a major law school to get an opinion and then bring that to court and use that before the court. We see these differences among muftis or legal scholars and differences therefore in their fatwas in recent times, when muftis have provided contrasting opinions or fatwas in the Salman Rushdie case, for example, and in the Gulf War of 1991. The Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa found Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, guilty of blasphemy, and he was condemned to death. That resulted, as many of you will recall, in his going into hiding. Now, other muftis, while deploring the book, called for his trial by Islamic law, and so that difference in approach. In the Gulf War, muftis' opinions varied in providing, on the one hand, supporting positions for Iraq, or on the other, support for the U.S.-led Armada that included Arab and Muslim countries. like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Similar differences of opinion have been seen more recently regarding the issue of suicide bombing and martyrdom, most particularly in Palestine, Israel today, and in that conflict. Now, a major area of Islamic law, and one that we need to mention both here and later on when we deal with the issue of women, that is in the class that we'll have on women, is Muslim family law. Because of the centrality of the community in Islam, the Muslim family, as the basic unit of society, enjoyed pride of place in the development and implementation of Islamic law. Muslim family law includes three major areas: marriage, divorce, and inheritance. While rulers in early Islam and today might limit, circumvent, or replace other areas of law, penal and commercial laws, for example, Muslim family law has generally remained in force. The formulation of Muslim family law has been subject to reform and widespread debate and revision since the 20th century, and we certainly see it today in the 21st century. The place of women in family law reform remains, therefore, an important, extremely sensitive, and hotly contested issue in Islam and in Muslim societies. The status of women and the family in Islamic law was the product of Arab culture, Quranic reforms, and foreign ideas and values assimilated from conquered people. The Quran introduced substantial reforms, providing new regulations and modifying local custom and practice. At the same time, much of the traditional pre-Islamic social structure and its extended family and the paramount position of males in a patriarchal society, I want to underscore the importance of patriarchal society, was incorporated. Marriage and family life are the expected norm in Islam. In contrast to Christianity, in Islam, marriage is not a sacrament but a contract between a man and a woman, or perhaps more accurately, between their families. In the traditional practice of arranged marriages, the families or guardians, not the bride and groom, are the two primary actors. The Quran introduced a number of reforms that enhanced the status of women. It recognized, for example, a woman's right to contract her own marriage and receive the dower from her husband in chapter 4, verse 4. Thus she became a party to the contract, not just an object for sale. In a society where no limitations on polygamy existed, the Quran sought to control and regulate polygamy, stipulating that a man could marry up to 4 wives, provided he could support and treat them equally. It's important to note here that the Quran did not require that a man marry 4 wives, but limited him to that number. The relationship between a husband and a wife in Islamic law is viewed as complementary, reflecting their differing characteristics, capacities, and dispositions, as well as the traditional roles of men and women, again, in the patriarchal family. The primary arena for the man is the public sphere. He's to support and protect the family. Women's primary role is that of wife and mother, managing the household, supervising the upbringing and religious training of their children. While both are equal before God and equally required to lead virtuous lives, in family matters and society, women were subordinate because of their more sheltered and protected lives and their dependency on men who had greater economic responsibilities in the extended family. Now, while divorce is permissible, both the Quran and the prophetic traditions underscore its seriousness. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Of all the permitted things, divorce is the most abominable with God." And an authoritative legal manual describes divorce as a dangerous and disapproved procedure as it dissolves marriage. In Arab society, men could divorce at will and on whim, and women had no grounds for divorce. The Quran and Islamic law introduced guidelines based on greater equity and responsibility to constrain a man's unbridled right to divorce and to establish a woman's right to a judicial court divorce. However, these laws were often compromised by social realities and circumvented. Thus, for example, a husband was required by law to pronounce the formula for divorce, "I divorce you," 3 times, once each month, for a period of 3 months, during which a time for reconciliation was to be pursued. In fact, some men bypassed the Quranically mandated 3-month waiting period, which is found in the Quran, chapter 65, verse 1, by saying, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you." 3 times all at one time. Now, while Islamic law considered such an act unapproved or deviant, it was nevertheless legally valid. The force of patriarchy was especially evident in the requirement that women, in contrast to men, go before a court and present grounds to obtain a divorce. Patriarchy also governed the rules of inheritance in pre-Islamic Arabia, according to which all property passed to the nearest male relative of the deceased. In contrast, the Quran gave rights to wives, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers of the deceased, guaranteeing them a fixed share before the inheritance, the remainder of the inheritance, could pass to the senior male. Men still inherited more than women, a fact that reflected gender relations in a male-dominated society, as well as a male's greater economic responsibilities. In practice, however, Quranic and legal reforms were often circumvented by families whose women were either ignorant of their rights or intimidated into not pursuing them. With the creation of modern nation-states in the 20th century, many Muslim governments implemented Western-inspired legal codes. However, family law was subject to reform rather than replacement. Among the key areas of concern were marriage, polygamy and child marriages, divorce and inheritance. This process of reform often set in motion a struggle between governments and their Western-oriented elite, who legislated or imposed change from above, and the ulama, religious scholars, who saw themselves as the defenders of the tradition of Islam and as the only qualified interpreters. Reforms raised the minimum age for marriage, requiring that men obtain permission from a court to take a second wife or to divorce, and expanded the grounds for women to obtain a divorce. Faced with resistance to legal reforms, governments did not pursue systematic reform, and compromises were made. Often the penalties, fines, and imprisonment for failure to comply with the law were minimal, were relatively light. The force of religious tradition could be seen in the fact that failure to comply with reform laws rendered an act illegal but not invalid, since few governments were willing to replace Islamic law and be accused of abrogating Sharia or God's law. Thus, if a man took another wife, his second marriage would be illegal and his progeny illegitimate in the eyes of the law, but not invalid in the eyes of God, according to many Islamic jurists. The tenuousness of family law reforms became evident in Muslim countries such as Iran and Pakistan in recent decades, as conservative ulama and Islamic movements pressed for their repeal. More fundamentalist and conservative voices reject reforms as un-Islamic and motivated by Western-oriented elites. They continue to pose a major obstacle to substantive reform. However, the momentum today for greater gender equality and the growing empowerment of women have increased pressure for and debate over substantive reform in many Muslim societies. Now we move or shift from the exterior path to the interior path, Sufism or mysticism. Like Islamic law, Sufism or Islamic mysticism began as a reform movement in the Umayyad Empire. Sufis found the emphasis on this life, in contrast to the next, on power and wealth, on Islam as a system of laws and rules, to be spiritually lacking. In contrast to the exterior path of law and duty, they emphasized the more interior path of piety and devotional love. These early Sufis or mystics were motivated by a desire to return to what they regarded as the purity and simplicity of the time of Muhammad, that led them to seek direct and personal experience now of God in this world. They pursued an ascetic lifestyle that emphasized detachment from the material world, repentance for sins, and focus on the Last Judgment. This ascetic lifestyle was symbolized by their wearing of a simple, coarse, woolen garment. Early Sufis dedicated themselves to a life of prayer, fasting, meditation on the Quran, and imitation of Muhammad. The early mystics typify the concerns and spirit of Sufism. Hassan al-Basri, who lived from 643 to 728, an eminent scholar, typifies the ascetic reaction to the extravagances, what he considered to be the decadence of imperial Islam. Thus he declared, "The lower material world is a house whose inmates labor for loss, and only abstention from it makes one happy in it. He who befriends it in desire and love for it will be made wretched by it, and his portion with God will be laid waste. For this world has neither worth nor weight with God, so slight it is. Both men and women participated in Sufism. Emphasis on ascetic detachment or renunciation of dependence on the material world was complemented by the contribution of Rabia al-Adawiyya, who died in 801, who fused asceticism with an undying devotional love of God. This combination of the ascetic with the ecstatic would permanently influence the future development of Sufism. An attractive and desirable woman, she declined all offers of marriage, not permitting anyone or anything to distract her from total dedication and commitment to God. The following words attributed to Rabia capture her selfless love and devotion. "O my Lord, if I worship you out of fear of hell, and if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from it. But if I worship you for your own sake, then withhold not from me your eternal beauty." The spread of Sufism led to the absorption of outside influences from the new areas to which Sufism spread, from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism adopted and adapted a variety of mystical doctrines, ranging from the sober to the intoxicated. Because of its adoption of external un-Islamic influences, Sufis came to be in conflict often with the more orthodox, legal-oriented, legal-minded ulama or religious scholars. Their conflicts revolved around issues of authority and power. The ulama typically sought to apply the letter of the law, while Sufis were more concerned with the spirit of the law. The majority of the ulama dismissed Sufi doctrine and practice as heretical deviation from orthodoxy. Many Sufis were persecuted and even executed as a result. A prominent theologian emerged to save the day, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. He synthesized and reconciled these diverse religious and philosophical currents of his day. Trained in law, theology, and philosophy, he responded to the major theological and philosophical challenges of his times. However, his brilliant career was cut short by a spiritual and psychological breakdown. In the midst of this spiritual crisis, al-Ghazali turned to Sufism, tempering reason and law with Sufism's emphasis on religious experience and love of God. The results were captured in what many consider to be his greatest work, the revivification of the religious sciences, which synthesized law, theology, and mysticism. Law and theology were presented in terms that were acceptable to the ulama, but were grounded in direct religious experience and interior devotion. Al-Ghazali's work led to his recognition as one of Islam's greatest scholars and earned him the title of the Renewer of Islam, a title which is reserved for one individual in each century for their work in revitalizing Islam. Now, Sufi orders emerged also around the 12th century, and it is the 12th century which proved to be a turning point, both because of al-Ghazali's legitimation of Sufism and the emergence of these orders or brotherhoods that transformed Sufism into a popular mass movement, cutting across social classes and educational backgrounds. Sufism grew now beyond its more urban elite roots. Its loose voluntary groups or associations that had met in mosques or private homes were replaced now by organized brotherhoods or religious orders, tariqas, with their own distinctive institutions and international networks. By the 13th century, brotherhoods had created international networks of centers or monasteries, zawiyas, that transformed Sufism into a mass movement, whose preachers were the great missionaries of Islam. Mystics, not the military, spread the faith from Africa to Southeast Asia. Sufism became integral and pervasive to popular religious practice and spirituality in Islam. Sufi spiritual leaders or masters, sheikhs or peers, enjoyed great religious influence, authority, and power, both spiritual and material. Sufi monasteries or compounds served as spiritual, social, educational, and cultural centers. Their buildings and services included the master's residence, living quarters, a mosque, school, hospice, soup kitchen to feed the poor, a clinic to care for the sick. Many of the characteristics, though, of Sufism find similar experiences in Christianity and other faiths. Sufi orders or brotherhoods formed with centers or monasteries. The investiture of initiates or disciples included distinctive garb of the order, a discipline of body and mind. Sufis recited a litany of God's names and attributes, counting them on a string of beads similar to a rosary. The founders of Sufi orders often came to be venerated as saints. Their tombs became sites for pilgrimage and even miracles. Their birth or death commemorated and celebrated. In contrast to more austere interpretations of Islam, some Sufis used music and song as well as dance and bodily movements. The followers of great Sufi mystics, Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who died in 1273, the whirling dervishes are a prime example, and they exist down to today. Popular Sufism at times did slip into magic and superstition, as well as withdrawal from the world. Some of the major Islamic revival or reform movements of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries sought to eliminate these superstitious practices. And it indeed are these practices and the reaction to them that we will look at when we turn to the rise of Islamic revivalist movements in the 17th and 18th century and look at Islamic modernist movements in the 19th and 20th century, and indeed other reform movements existing down to the 21st century.